This is course 3 of the Consuming Watson Services in Python to Run on Bluemix series. In course 3, so far, we've created a REST API. This was because we had a composite service of language identification, language translation, using natural language classifier to determine intent, and then using alchemy language to determine keywords and entities. Your application was becoming non-responsive. We created a REST API so that your application could become responsive, and it was an API that encapsulated all 4 services into a simple API. The side benefit of that was that you now have a service, an API, that is reusable and can be consumed by other applications. We now have hard-coded credentials, and we're going to look at how we can protect those. So let's look at the source code. We're going to be operating in Flask. In natural language classification utils, we see that we have a superclass of base service. Then in the initialization constructor method, we construct the superclass with the string natural language classifier, and then we instantiate natural language classifier passing in a username and password credentials using getUser and getPassword methods. If we have a look at the alchemy language utils, we have something similar. Again, we have a superclass of base service, which we construct with an alchemy API string, and then the alchemy language service we instantiate passing in the API using the method getAPIKey. So let's look at the base service method that they both inherit from, as well as the language translation. So we have a credential store and vcap services. Credential store is for storing locally held credentials, and vcap settings is for Bluemix held credentials. So we initialize the 3 variables, username, password and API key to dummy values, and then we call getVcap settings to pull in the credentials in the Bluemix environment. If we don't find them, we look in the local store. So the Bluemix credentials take precedence. Then at the end we have getUser, getPassword and getAPIKey methods, which our constructors are using. So let's look at the 2 files, credentials and vcap. Vcap py is for Bluemix, and this is general Bluemix methodology for obtaining vcap services. Vcap services are held in an environment variable, so we use os environment get to get hold of the vcap services, and then we loop around looking for a match for our key, for example language translation, natural language classifier or alchemy language. And if we do find the key, we return the credentials, but that's really all we're interested in. And that takes care of the Bluemix side, and Bluemix will protect the credentials. So what if we don't have Bluemix credentials, we need to supply them locally, and we don't want to hard code them, so we put them into a credentials JSON file. And this JSON file will not be in our source code repository, so we'll specify it in gitignore if we're using Git, but we will want to upload this into the Bluemix environment, so we will not specify it in cfignore. So we look for the credentials JSON file in the same directory as this source code. When I first started, I put it in static, and other developers told me that was a bad idea because static is public and the credentials JSON file is not something that you want to put into a public place. So we load the JSON file, and we have a method getCreds that allows our application to pull in the credentials for the particular service. Let's look at the credentials JSON file, which I've said should not be in a public place, so it should not be in static. You do not want to put this into a source code repository, so if you're using Git, you specify it in gitignore. But you do not specify it in cfignore because we do want this file to end up in Bluemix. We're going to get rid of language translation and natural language classifier because we're going to use Bluemix for those, but we will keep alchemy API. We'll save the file, and we're now ready to try our application locally. So let's start up the server running locally. And we'll try it out with some sample text. Process the REST call, we see its service has failed. Look at the logs, it's because of invalid credentials, which is what we expected. If we do the process the sync call, we'll see a more appropriate message. So now ready to push our application to Bluemix. We check the runtime txt is set to 351, and we check that the manifest file, the name and the host are set appropriately. And now we can push our application up to Bluemix. Now, the reason why we're specifying Alchemy in our local credentials file is that it's actually quite difficult to bind in an Alchemy service into an application, because every time you do, it generates a new API key and you're not allowed more than one API key. So the only way to do it is to add in a new instance of Alchemy, but if you already have one, you can't bind it. So this is why we're using the local file. The application has been pushed and is running. To refresh the page. Find our application. Note we have no services bound in. We'll try our application out. Here we can see the 401 invalid credentials error. So let's bind in our services. To reiterate, we will not be binding in Alchemy because that would just generate a new API key, and we already have a service, so we're going to use the local credentials file for that. We add in language translation. We won't restage at this stage because we want to add in natural language classifier. And we're now ready to restage. Let's try the application. This time the REST call gives us a response, as does the sync call. And we can try in a different language. And we can see that the language is identified, the text is translated, and we've determined the intent. Though our intent corpus needs a little bit of work. So now we have a credential store in which we can keep our credentials secure and which we can use to override Bluemix. And we've also seen how to use the binding the services in Bluemix using the credentials. That completes the course. You now know how to run Python applications in Bluemix, how to consume Watson services and create REST APIs and keep your credentials secure.